Howdy, pickers. How are you guys doing? You guys digging to China down here? Oh my gosh. How's your feed situation? Oh, you guys need more feed. Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. Today I'm talking about forage testing, but first I gotta do a few things. I gotta fill up the pig's feed, I gotta water the heifers, and then I'm gonna do a lot of yakety yakking, because there's a lot to forage testing. We don't want those pigs to go hungry, so I'll take care of them first. All right, you little monsters. Hiya, ladies. I'm going to fill up your water tank. I think I'll call this video Forage Testing for Dummies, and I'm one of the dummies. Remember those books way back when, such and such for dummies? I actually learned how to play the piano that way. Anyway, forage testing isn't like that. Once you get your test back, you get this whole string of numbers, and it's not like when you get a blood test done at the doctor's where it's got normal ranges off to the right. There's nothing. So interpreting a forage test is not easy, and I had to look all over the place online, various cooperative extension websites and research papers. I'm going to distill that and give it to you in an easily digestible form, which is appropriate for a forage video, I think. But first we got to finish watering these ladies. They're thirsty. What are you doing? Don't play in the water. Drinking the hard way. To start our discussion of forage analysis, let's go straight to the source. Our hay. We grow a mixed grass and legume hay, which we also use for pasture, and it contains 6 or 8 different species of grasses and legumes, including timothy, alfalfa, orchard grass, perennial ryegrass, alfalfa, red clover, white clover, and ladino clover. And we have 3 basic types of hay in here. The first type is first cutting hay, which these ladies are chomping on now. And it is a stalkier hay that's baled at a later maturity than second cutting hay, so you get more stemmy stuff in it. There's legumes and some seed heads mixed in with this. The second type of hay is second cutting hay. Oh, the cows want hay, which is more younger, tender, leafy stuff with, again, legumes mixed in. There's some alfalfa leaves and clover leaves mixed in here. Altogether a more palatable hay. And I'll tell you, when I throw this in, they're going to eat it right up. Oh yeah, we prefer that. And the third type of hay we have is this stuff, which we purchased. This is first cutting hay that's a bit earlier than our first cutting, so it is stemmier than our second cut. And there's very few legumes in it. It's mostly just grass. Let's do the taste test with this. I don't know. Not so enthused. I had separate testing done for each of these 3 types of hay, and I'll put up on the screen now what the test reports look like, one after the other. First cutting, second cutting, and purchased hay. And here's where we can talk about the types of testing you can do, because there's a whole bunch of options. We had the simple test done, which is called commonly a dry test versus a wet chemistry test, and it consists of NIR, or near infrared spectroscopy. And it gives you a good sense of the general characteristics of the hay and the macronutrients. When you get into the fine, small trace nutrients, all the miscellaneous little vitamins that cattle need, you're looking more at wet chemistry. And this becomes particularly important with dairy farming, where you have high energy output cattle and you need to know exactly what they're getting in their ration. But for beef cattle, a basic dry chemistry test serves just fine, as long as you're also feeding supplemental free choice mineral so they can get those micronutrients that they need. As you can see from those reports, you can be lost if you don't know the territory. And let's start with 2 basic terms, which if you only look at 2 lines on the report, these are the 2 to look at: CP and TDN. CP is crude protein percentage, and TDN is total digestible nutrients. So if I look at my cheat sheet here, comparing the 3 types of hay, our first cutting crude protein was 8.8%, second cutting 14.9%, and the purchased hay was 8.2%. So the purchased hay was kind of roughly equivalent to our first cutting hay, and our second cutting hay is much higher, like almost twice of what first cutting is in terms of crude protein. Now, crude protein is not like we digest crude protein. You eat a steak and it goes straight to building muscle, right? With cattle, there's actually bacteria in the rumen that need that protein to digest cellulose. So when you see cow patties in the wintertime and they're all real hard and ridgy and stiff, that's a protein, that's a low protein intake by the cattle that are causing that, and they can't digest the cellulose as well because those bacteria in the rumen aren't getting the nutrition that they need. So protein is kind of an inverse relationship where the bacteria digest the protein and then they in turn help the cow to digest the cellulose in the hay to create carbohydrates and give energy. It's one of those interesting things about cattle digestive systems. Let's get back to my blood test analogy. So what is great protein in hay? What is poor protein in hay? I'm going to put a chart up on the screen that shows the typical ranges and classifications. And they're divided into two groups, grass hay and legume hay, which is either all one or all the other. We're growing mixed hay, so we fall someplace in between that. But you can see that excellent grass hay is 12% and above protein content, and legume excellent hay is 18% or above content. Legumes are your concentrated source of protein. And I need to note that for everything I'm talking about here, there's two columns. If you look back on the original test report, there's as fed on the left, and then just to right of that, there's dry matter. You want to look at dry matter. That's the percentage after they bake the sample down to remove the moisture, and that's kind of the industry standard for how these reports are generated. So our hay's looking pretty good from a protein standpoint. You know, it being a mixture and that not falling into clear lines on the table. Our first cutting and purchased hay is 8 to 9% crude protein, and so we're looking at fair hay or so, and then second cutting is great hay. It's excellent hay. And that's just the nature of second cutting hay. You can catch it when it's at its optimum growth stage, when the fiber versus nutrients ratio is where you want it to be and there's less indigestible fiber in it. And that's one of the things I'm going to get to soon. And hi, ladies. Now remember, I said the big two are CP and TDN, crude protein and total digestible nutrients. And I'm going to need my cheat sheet here to tell you about total digestible nutrients. Total digestible nutrients is the estimate of the energy content of the feed or roughage. It's calculated by a formula, because this is where it gets complicated, that uses the ADF, acid detergent fiber, the NDF, the neutral detergent fiber, crude protein, and the ash components of the hay to give an estimated value of energy. Wow. Let's get some normal ranges so you can tell what your test report is telling you. Typically, the greater the value of TDN, the better the hay you've got. So if you look across our numbers, we're about 57, 58% TDN, and that's considered a high quality hay. And here are the normal ranges. Lower quality hays are 40 to 50% TDN, total digestible nutrients. Higher quality hays are in the 50 to 60% range. And super duper excellent hay that contains a lot of legumes can be in the 60 to 70% TDN range. So to summarize up these two prime components, I have more charts and graphs, and I'll put this one up on the screen. This shows you both total digestible nutrients, TDN, and crude protein percentage for various growth stages and situations of cattle. And you can just look at this chart and see where you're falling to gauge whether the hay you're feeding is appropriate. Oh, and by the way, you better be taking notes because there's going to be a test at the end, and it is not multiple choice, it's essay. So get those pencils out. I'm heading down to the shop where the heat's on and it's warm. And my glasses are there. I can't read worth a crap without my glasses. It's nice and warm in here. Before I finish the discussion on sort of overall hay metrics, there's two other systems that are mentioned in the hay report that I'll talk about. The first is RFV, which is relative feed value. It's similar to TDN in that it's an overall assessment of the hay, but it's based on something different. Relative feed value is compared to full bloom alfalfa, what the nutritional characteristics of that hay would be, full bloom alfalfa. So full bloom alfalfa would be 100 on the relative feed value chart. And our hays for first cutting were in the high 70s compared to that 100 for alfalfa for first cutting. And then the second cutting was in the high 80s. So I consider our second cutting really good. I mean, alfalfa is, you know, the high protein kind of standard for hay, and we're coming pretty close to that. The second sort of system that I want to mention, and this is employed by dairies more than beef farmers, is the net energy of the feed. And on the original reports, you'll see a whole bunch of line that are NEG, NEM. Those are net energy gain, net energy maintenance, net energy lactation is another one. Dairy farmers use this to match the nutrition of the feed that they're giving their cattle to what that cattle's stage in growth is and what their situation is. Not very applicable and awfully complicated to use in beef farming, at least at my scale. Oh geez, I just remembered I forgot something important. Moisture percentage right at the top of the report. You can see ours measured out at around 15%. For me, that's the line. We baled on the wet side this year because we were always racing the weather, but the danger zone for round bales is about 18%. Above 18%, you're significantly at the risk of the bales heating up, degrading, and even of fire. With square bales, it's about 20%. The next thing to cover is fiber. Fiber is a huge part of hay, right? And cellulose is a fiber. And what we're talking about here is primarily the components of the cell walls in the plant. And when you get to fibrous hay, that is more mature hay, you get a bigger percentage of cellulose in the hay because that's the structural material that the plant uses. There's two, these guys are running low on hay, by the way. There's two different fiber tests in hay, NDF and ADF on the report. NDF is neutral detergent fiber, and that has to do with the test. They use a detergent to separate out the fiber, and the neutral pH fiber is the NDH. Neutral detergent, yeah, NDH. ADH is the acid detergent fiber, and that's a subset of NDF. So NDF is always the bigger number, and you can use NDF to tell what the sort of overall digestibility and palatability of the hay is. Because what happens is the percentage of fiber increases in the hay, the cattle spend more time and energy digesting that hay instead of eating more hay. So you've got a lot of chew time with high fiber hay and less total intake in terms of nutrient density. So what are the normal ranges going back to the blood test? Legume forages, NDF should be below 40. That's a good number, 40%. And above 50% for legume forages that are over mature would be considered poor. For grass forages, you're looking for an NDF below 50%, and that's considered high quality grass forage. And greater than 60% is low quality hay, really over mature hay. So where do we stand? So many cheat sheets and papers, I have trouble finding what I need to tell you guys. Where do we stand? Not that one. NDF is where our hay kind of falls on its face, and it's a product of the climate here. Usually we can't get around to making first cutting until the hay is past prime because of just the weather. It's late June, early June sometimes. You got to wait until you get a drying window. So we're in the low to high 60s for that percentage of fiber in the hay, and surprisingly, it surprises me, our second cutting is also just over the line, just above 60%. I would have expected it to be better because it's pretty tender stuff. Although, and this is a function of pulling reference material from multiple sources, there is some disagreement about what normal range NDF is. I've read other sources that say 50 to 80% is considered decent forage. So I guess we're doing all right. And this has a lot of implications. You know, haymaking is an art as much as a science. So when you hear farmers say something like, well, I'm going to cut all 3 cuttings at the same time all at once in September, you're getting a high NDF out of that over-mature dead hay standing in the field. And also things like tedding and raking, doing them at the proper time so you don't have as much leaf shatter, and particularly with legumes, leaf loss where it just falls right off the plant because you're tedding it too dry or raking it too dry. These are really important details that affect both the overall protein percentage in the hay, the NDF, and the trace minerals too. You guys don't mind the snow, do you? You stand out here and chew your cuds? Yeah. So at this point I've covered the major items in the report, the most important things like crude protein, total digestible nutrients, and fiber percentage. Now you'll notice there's a whole bunch of other lines on this report, and I'm just looking at the top half of the report right now. There's things like NDICP, I covered ADF, I covered ANDF. Lignin is a subset of that NDF. You've got starch, you've got carbohydrates, and fat. For some reason, and I'm not sure exactly why, analysis of these doesn't really focus on fats and carbohydrates that much. What I infer is that cattle kind of make their own carbohydrates through the action of the rumen. So when you look at fiber and protein, those are really the key energy factors in hay, more so than fat or carbohydrates. And it usually isn't judged that much to tell you, how your forage is, except probably in the dairy industry where they're looking at fine details. Now, speaking of fine details, let's get to the smaller stuff, and that's the macronutrients. That's the bottom part of the report that you see: calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sulfur. Those are macronutrients, and trace mineral for cattle is grouped into two classifications. You've got the macronutrients that I just listed that cows need in relatively larger quantities versus the trace nutrients, things like selenium and cobalt, and I have an old video with a whole list of them that scrolls across the screen. This basic dry chemistry report doesn't cover those small trace, what I call vitamins and minerals, because usually as a beef producer you're feeding those as free choice mineral, and the cattle are usually, they know how to take in enough of that, and usually that's mixed with salt, which helps encourage them to take in enough. With macronutrients, you have to do a lot of researching. It's kind of like when you take a vitamin, and certain kinds of vitamins are tied together. So if you take a B complex, there's other vitamins that help you absorb the one vitamin. And it's that way with cattle macronutrients too. For instance, just looking around, the ratio of calcium to phosphorus should be between 2 to 1 and 4 to 1 in order for proper absorption by the cattle. So you want to look at those kinds of relationship with macronutrients. And the other thing I took from the macronutrient report is, I'm always wondering, because our hay fields are fertilized with manure off of the farm, and the cattle eat trace mineral, and then it winds up on the fields because they pass most of that trace mineral. Exactly how our crop is doing in terms of trace mineral content, and by my eye, the percentages in the report look good. And when I compared them to the purchased hay, which I know is being made off of ground that is working off stored nutrients, they're not adding fertilizer back in any form, that trace nutrients are some of the things that falter first. And that's what I see in the report. If you look at the relative percentages of our second cutting hay versus the purchased hay, some of those trace nutrients are 200, 300% in our second cutting hay of what that purchased hay is. So you need to replenish the ground and think of your hay ground as sort of part of that nutrient system. Is one of the reasons that we rotate pasture and hay fields year to year, and we focus so much on composting manure to replenish the nutrients we're taking off with hay. So I think I hit all the important things about what you look for in hay, being a beef farmer when you get hay test results back. Some final notes. We had a cow die, an 11-year-old cow die a couple weeks ago, and hay is one of the things we went and did testing on to make sure that we were feeding the right sort of nutrient mix, and it turns out we were. Hay was not the problem. The second part of that is we had the vets here yesterday, and they took fecal samples for parasites. The vet's opinion was that it would not have been parasites unless it was liver flukes. And she checked over the body condition of our cows, said that they all looked good. No problems there. I got to chalk it up to just kind of it was a stroke, a heart attack, something sudden. It wasn't endemic to our herd, and it's good to have the data. Having data and numbers is always reassuring in my book, as long as you can tell what the numbers mean, and that's what I attempted to give you in that in this video. Now, in terms of the mechanics of getting hay tests done, we have a local laboratory, Dairy One. You can ship to them from anywhere in the world and they'll do the testing. There's other laboratories around the US. It costs us $19 a sample for this basic test, so it's not a lot of money. It's about a 24-hour turnaround for them to do the test, and it's something I'd recommend everybody does, so you know what you're feeding, and especially if you're buying in hay, so that you know, because you know how it is when you deal with buying in hay, you never know exactly what you're getting unless you get the data. I hope this video is helpful. This is something I can't find cohesive information for anything on the web, and I'm trying to provide it here. If there's anything I didn't cover that you're wondering about, ask about in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer you. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. And I made this video for myself as much as anybody else, because next year when I have our hay tested again, I'm going to have forgotten all this stuff. I'll have to go back and watch the video too.